Good evening. It's Tuesday night, and in this week's edition of Book Talk with Cara, I have my friend Carrie Turansky. If you have not had the opportunity to meet Carrie or read any of her books, you will definitely enjoy getting to know her through our conversation tonight. She writes beautifully woven romances and family sagas set during the World War I Edwardian era. And so we're going to talk about her brand new book, but also her others. So Carrie, would you like to take a minute to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. It's great to be with you tonight. Thanks, Cara, for having me on. I was born in Oregon, but live in New Jersey, and I've been married for many
About
years.
her
My
brand new
husband,
book, but
Scott,
also her others. So,
and
sorry.
he and I have 5 adult children and 7 grandkids. And I've been writing for about 20 years. And my last 7 books are all English historicals, like Cara said, set in the Edwardian era. So I'm excited to be able to talk to you about those tonight and just to have a good chat.
Yeah, so when I started digging into this one, and it's No Journey Too Far, and it's the second in the series, but I love that it stands completely on its own. You don't need to have read anything else. But how did you land on the time period and the theme? Because you're dealing with the British home children, which I had never heard of. So how did you stumble on that?
Okay, let's see. Couple years ago, I saw a photograph on Facebook and it had 3 or 4 little children who were really ragged and poor. And I thought, oh, they look like they're from the time period that I've been setting a lot of my books in. And so I followed that back and I found a Facebook group about the British home children. And it was their descendants who were all looking for information about their family members that had come from England to Canada. And so I did a little research and found out that there were more than 100,000 of these poor and orphan children who were sent, across the Atlantic to try to start a new life in Canada. But most of them were not adopted. Most of them had to come as indentured workers. And unfortunately, at the time, there was a lot of prejudice against them. And so they say 60% of these kids suffered abuse or neglect. So when I heard that, my heart really went out to that situation. I thought, oh, that's a great thing I need to write about. People need to understand that. I mean, it's kind of similar to the orphan train movement that we had here in the US, where they took poor kids out of New York City and took them to the farms out in the Midwest, that kind of thing. And actually, the people that started the British Home Children's movement heard the orphan train people speaking in London. And they thought, oh, well, we could send our kids across, to Canada. That was their dominion over here in North America. And so that's what they decided to do. And so I decided to write about that. And I actually wrote the first book is The Ocean Too Wide. So that tells the first part of the story. And then the second book is set 10 years later because I really wanted to explore and help people understand what happened to these children as they became young adults and they finished their indentured contracts. How did they, start out in life? How did they overcome obstacles, that kind of thing. So it was kind of interesting setting books 10 years apart and just following one family and what happened to them and their family trying to be reunited.
So what I found interesting is, there was lots that was interesting, but one of the things that really stuck out to me was the idea that their family wasn't gone. So it wasn't that they were orphans, it was that they were poor.
Yes, a lot of the kids, just the way society was at that time, if there was an illegitimate child or one parent died or the situation didn't seem, quote, moral to the people who were running the children's homes, they had the legal right to come and take the children. And they could not just keep them in the homes, but they could send them to Canada without the parents, if they had a living parent, knowledge or permission. That they only had to send the parent a sailing notice after they sailed. And then that you would know your child was sent across.
Oh my goodness. So they literally could come in, take your child, and not let you know what they were doing until it's really too late to
Yeah,
change anything.
yeah, that's what happened to a lot of the kids. So, I mean, some were poor, in the workhouses without parents. Some were taken off the street. So there were children like that. But there were also a lot of the children that had only, one living parent or in a poor situation. And so the kids were taken away and then sent off to Canada.
That makes me think of what was happening in Tennessee with that woman that Lisa Wingate highlighted in Before You Were Mine. And we want to think that those things can't happen. That wouldn't really be a part of our history or anything like that. And yet, in some ways, it can still happen today with the government being able just to come in and take your kids and then have to prove later why they took them. And so it's kind of scary and sobering, just to see. And you set up in the second book kind of a dichotomy between the experiences of the children. How often did that happen, where some kids would go one way and other kids would be taken to a different location?
There's I did a lot of research and read a lot of true accounts from the children that they wrote when they grew up, that kind of thing, and passed down to their relatives. And so a lot of the siblings were separated. That was really common. So I mean that a lot. It was hard to find, spots for them to stay together. So that usually didn't happen.
And that's just tragic. I mean, when you think about how much more we know today about child psychology and the importance of that bonding and being part of the family unit and all of that, even if you ended up being put in a good situation, it still has a traumatic effect on the kid. So when you're writing something like that, I mean, in order for us as readers to feel the emotion, that means you as the writer have to really dig into the characters and experience it. So how did you manage to do that? Because that is all very real in the context of the book. And I could definitely feel all the angst and the deep emotion.
Well, I mean, through the research and reading those true life accounts of what people went through, I mean, that just really gripped me. So, I mean, a lot of the experiences that I put in the book, I took from those. I wove together many different children's stories, but most of the events in the first book, No Ocean Too Wide, and in the second book, No Journey Too Far, are taken out of things that actually happened. So for me, thinking of it, this really happened to someone. It was easier for me to really get into the emotion of what the characters might experience. And then we are adoptive parents of our two youngest were came to us through the foster care system, and it was a long process to be able to adopt them. And there was a lot of heartache in their background, that kind of thing. And so kind of have a perspective from that too.
Absolutely. And having, adoptions are one of the few areas in the law that I still actively practice in, because I think it's so critical to help children find their place in that forever home where they can be safe. But there's definitely risk. I mean, you're opening yourself up to not knowing 100% how this child was necessarily treated in the past, and the fact that they're up for adoption means there's some kind of trauma, even if it was a birth placement, there's still, it's amazing how deeply that goes. So once you've experienced it, though, it does give you that emotional depth to be able to mine and be like, okay, I know what this is like. It's not a huge leap to then go, okay, this is how this mother would feel or this child would feel when you've seen that. So do you, how do you bring a little bit of levity or hope into what could otherwise feel like, just really heavy and dark?
Well, I think that's really important because, like you say, it is a heavy topic, but I always want to write with weave in the hope and how God is working in the situation and helping the different characters through what's going on. And so it's definitely an uplifting story, and that the family does get reunited and how they overcome all the obstacles. And so faith is really woven in. There's a lot of faith. I just listened to it on audio. It's fun. It just came out on audio last week. And I thought, oh, I want to listen, be sure the narrator did a good job. So I listened to it, and it's fun experience to hear, even if though it's my story and I read it like a million times while I was editing and writing, that kind of thing, still listening to it is a different experience. And it was good. It was great to listen to it that way. And the narrator did do an excellent job with all the different voices. There's a lot of characters. So she had a real challenge to try to bring the story to light that way.
Yeah, and it's always interesting, kind of scary to listen to your words and go, okay, how is this going to translate? And I don't know about you, but I hear the characters in my head. But like when I'm reading your books, I hear your voice in my head.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, so when I know the author, I do. When I'm reading it, it's like you're narrating it to me. And so then, but with a book like this, it would be really fun to listen to the audiobook because you've got the British accents, the Canadian accents. And so was she able to capture all of those well?
Yeah, she did pretty well with it. I felt like, she did a good job. She also did No Ocean Too Wide. So that was kind of nice that the same narrator could do both books. So people, when they listened to one, it would be almost like an unbroken story and you could continue on. The funny thing is when I first wrote No Ocean Too Wide, um, the cover said that it was book one. And so people would know from the beginning that there was going to be a book two, because I don't finish, all the families not reunited in the first book because there was going to be a second book, but they changed the cover and they took that off. So many people read the first book and I got some poor reviews from a few people because they're like, why didn't you just add 100 pages and tell the rest of the story? We want to know what happened to Garth and Grace. And then the book got delayed because I actually had a cancer journey in the middle while I was writing the second book. So it actually came out a whole year later than when it was supposed to. So people were like, when are we going to find out what happens to Garth and Grace? So I was so happy that I could finally get the book out, and people have really, several people have written and said, oh, I'm so glad we finally got to find out what happens. So that's been fun to kind of see how people were emotionally invested in the story and they really wanted to see this family reunited. And so that was the fun aspect of having this second book come out.
Well, and that is actually a really great sign that you did a good job with the first book, that your readers were so invested that they're like, I have to know what happens next.
Yeah, and I did try to give some of the characters were reunited and, there was I thought a positive conclusion at the end of the first book. So I didn't totally leave them hanging, but I didn't bring everybody home. So that's what they were concerned about, is what would happen to the last people. But I did want to take a minute and thank you for your help on this second book. And because there's like a legal case in this second book, and you really were helpful to me as I talked it through with you. And I've had several people say they really liked the courtroom scenes and they felt like that was handled well. And I was like, oh, well, thank you, Cara.
That's awesome.
I really would not. I mean, I've watched a lot of shows, but I really had questions about how to handle it and try to do that. So even my editor was pleased with that part. So I was very grateful for your tips and wisdom and how to weave that into the story and make it sound somewhat reasonable.
That's awesome. My theory is if you have an attorney as a friend, you should be able to ask them those kinds of questions. So I'm just glad it was helpful. So what was one of the big challenges of jumping the timeline forward an hour? Because or not an hour, 10 years, because that's that's a big jump. And so you're asking, how did you figure out what was going to happen with those characters?
Well, and probably the biggest challenge was how do you fill that in the second book without it being a big dump of the background of what happened in those 10 years. So I had to kind of weave that in. So I think that worked pretty successfully. I mean, there is a whole story there in the middle that I could write, and people keep saying to me now, oh, I wish you'd write another book, about that family. So I could go back in the middle and write another one of what happened after the first daughter comes home. And because in the second book, she's married and already has a child and waiting to have another baby and stuff. And she's still waiting for her sister to come home. But anyway, it was fun. And I knew that, that second book had to focus on this young adult experience. And because so many of the stories that I read in the research just talked about how these young people struggle as they, finish their contract. It's kind of like kids who age out of the foster care system now. You're 18 and you're done, you're on your own. You're like, whoa, I have to face life. And if you don't have a family, and maybe you have learned some skills on the farm or the house, wherever you worked or whatever, but to make it on your own and to overcome the prejudice and establish yourself, that's a tough thing. And so I really felt like that deserved a book. So
yeah, no, that's really fun because I remember one of my World War II books was about the British children who were evacuated. And in my case, I put the child in Ohio because there were quite a few children who were placed there because of basically kind of an agreement between two companies. And so there was a relationship between the heads of the companies. And so the one in Ohio said, we'll find employees who will take these children into their homes. But as you dig into the books and the memoirs, you really do see that it has long-term consequences. Even when you were placed in a good situation,
Mhm.
it's traumatic, it's disruptive, it's not where you think, I mean, it's not where you're supposed to be. And so it is. And so to see that, to allow readers to kind of experience, okay, this is what it was like, is actually a gift. Because, you know, one of the things I love about fiction is it helps us gain empathy for people and experiences that are unlike our own. So as you look at what's happening and kind of where you're going to go next, do you think you'll go back and fill in that story?
I'm not sure. I mean, I did connect. There's a whole groups of people in Canada who are these descendants. And I mean, I have an avid reader fan base there now of people that just love reading the stories because so many of them had a grandmother or a grandfather or aunt or uncle that came to Canada that way. And they all they have is just the basic records and they really want to know what the experience was like for their relative. And so when they read these books, they love it. And they've been very kind. And several of the leaders of that group have, they go out and speak and they take the books and share them with people that way.
Well,
So
that's wonderful. So you've got like this fan base of, and like evangelists for you going, hey, she captured it. This is great.
yeah.
So this isn't the first set of books that you've written in this time period. I would say you kind of landed on the Downton Abbey Gilded, not quite Gilded Age, more Edwardian. What's the distinction between those? And how did you decide that this was a time period that you wanted to own?
Um, right when Downton Abbey was coming out, I happened to go to a librarians conference in Philadelphia with Kathy Goki, and she was the honored author and I was the guest. And I saw an editor there who I had met at ACFW. And I thought, oh, here's my chance. I'm going to go talk to her and see if I can just network a little bit. And so we chatted and she, oh, yes, I remember meeting you kind of thing. And then I said to her, well, what are you looking for? And she said, well, Downton Abbey is very popular, and I would like to see a series that's set in that time period that has an inspirational uh, book. And she said maybe it could have a heroine like Jane Eyre and a brooding heroine kind of. I think that would be a good book. And I said, oh, that's a great idea. So, but at that time I hadn't written anything about England. I didn't know much about it. But when I talked to Kathy about it, she had just released a book called Promise Me This about a young boy who stows away on the Titanic in 1912. And she said, oh, I know all about that era. I got all these research books. I'll load you up. You could do this. You should do it. It's a great idea. So she really encouraged me. And I just started reading and watching, documentaries and different things, watch some more Downton Abbey. And I thought, this is good. I really wanted to write longer historicals. And so I put together a proposal and gave it to my agent and he sent it out and it got a lot of response right away because they were looking for inspirational books that were set in that time period, which is from 1900 through World War I. The Gilded Age is starts a little bit earlier. It's more in the US, kind of they call it that here in the US, like 1880s through the early 1900s. They're kind of that same time period. But Edwardian goes along with King Edward, who was a king at that time in England. So that's kind of that time period.
So what's something that you learned in all of your research that is something that made you go, huh, that's really odd and different?
Oh, well, I was surprised at just at all the inventions and things that they had at that time. And so it made it so that, you were back in history a bit, but it wasn't so far removed that it would be people would feel disconnected from it. I mean, there were still cars were just coming in, people were just getting telephones, electricity was coming into homes. And so it seemed like a time period we could relate to well, but it still had kind of a little bit of the romance of the Victorian time and, that you could see in the dress and the homes and some of the customs and that kind of thing, which made it more romantic kind of time period that people seem to like. So I really enjoy setting books there. So I've written 7 in that time period in England.
That's so fun. And I think bustles were gone by then, right?
Yes, they were.
It's amazing the things we have to research when we're writing historical, because if you don't get it right, someone's going to let you know.
That's true. That's very true. Yeah.
So what's something that a reader sent you either via note or contacted you somehow and said, hey, you got this wrong. And you were like, no. I actually did my research.
I haven't had too much of that. I've had people just ask me more like how I found things out. Like one of my books talked about early aviation and the race to be the first to fly across the English Channel. That one's called Across the Blue, and it's a standalone. And really loved learning about early aviation and those airplanes, that kind of thing. So some people ask me questions like how I learned it, but I did it all online, a little bit of research at the National Air and Space Museum, but just totally Googling it and watching documentaries and reading books and trying to do my best research that I can. So I haven't got called on too many things yet. My editor picked out a couple things in one book about, I said there were copper pipes in a greenhouse, and she pointed out, no, not yet. So it's more the copy editor who gives me trouble than my readers.
Well, but that's why it's great to have, the support of a publisher with all those levels of editing,
Yeah.
because sometimes they'll point out stuff like that and you're like, no, here's my research, here's the citation. And other times you're like, oh, how did I miss that? Other than it's just there's so much to wrap your arms around.
Yeah.
So what kind of stories do you want to tell next?
Well, let's see. I'm working on one that's actually a time slip that's set in the Lake District of England. And I visited there on my last research trip and just fell in love with that area. And we went to see Hilltop, which is Beatrix Potter's beautiful home there, and just spent some time in that area. It's so pretty. If you ever seen the movie Miss Potter, it's about Beatrix Potter's life, and she actually helped start part of the National Trust, which preserved a lot of that area so that it would stay beautiful and natural for people. It's just a lovely area. And there's also Christian history there. There's a town called Keswick, and they had an annual convention, and a lot of famous missionaries like Amy Carmichael and Hudson Taylor were inspired to begin their missionary work by attending this convention. And it's kind of like in the US, we would have summer camp or camp meeting, that kind of thing. Well, here they called it convention. And they had different Christian speakers come in, and Christians would come from all over England and come there for a week in the summer and just enjoy that. So I wanted to kind of include that. So I have a historical heroine who is the daughter of a religious speaker who would be one who'd come to this kind of a convention, but he actually is leading a double life and passes away at the beginning of the story, and she discovers love letters. And then she has to decide, this kind of shatters her faith because she just adored her father, if she's going to keep that a secret or what she's going to do and how her faith is going to come back. So she has father issues. And then the contemporary heroine is also has father issues. She never knew her father, and she's an art evaluator for fine arts and antiques. And she's sent to the Lake District after she makes a terrible mistake and calls an original a copy before it was auctioned. So she has to redeem herself. And while she's there, she finds connections to her father's family and actually reads a journal that's of this person that's the historical heroine. And they both learn about the good father and the good shepherd. And there's a lot of sheep there. So I'm going to weave in a shepherd as a hero for the historical character and try to weave that all together. I've never written a time slip, but I just admired a lot of books that are written that way. And I've written both contemporary and historical. So I thought that'd be fun. I'd love to try that. So that's the challenge I'm up for right now.
Well, Beth says that sounds really good, and I agree. And I love the idea of it. A really well done time slip is so intricate. And as readers, we don't necessarily pick up on that. But as writers, it actually takes a lot of work to figure out what the two timelines are going to be and how they're going to connect and what the theme's going to be that fits both of those time periods. So my hat's off to you, because that can be a lot of work. So what are some of the time slip novels that you've read that made you go, oh, I really want to try writing this?
Okay. Well, Kathy Goki, her Secret She Kept is a really wonderful one. That's a time slip that I really admire. And then Melanie Dobson continually writes beautiful ones, and so does Heidi Schiavaroli. I just read her one that's like related to Little Women's House, the Orchard House one. And then Amanda Dykes, also some beautiful time slips. I haven't read the newest one that came out today, but the one that she won a Christie for a couple of years ago, I really enjoyed. So there's several that I've really, just taking notes while I'm reading and enjoying the story.
Yeah. Well, and I love when both stories are strong enough that I want to race through each of them to get to what's happening next. And I think keeping that tension high can be really challenging, or getting us to fall in love with both sets of characters and the, challenges and problems. And when it's done well, it's such an immersive experience as a reader. So I can't wait to see what you do with that. That'll be a lot of fun. So you've come through a cancer journey, and I mean, talk about the last year and a half, 2 years has just been really intense for you. So how can people be praying for you, and what do you want people to know about that kind of an experience? Because you've walked through it with such grace and such faith that I think we all have something we can learn from you in that.
Well, let's see. Let's see. God is always with you. That's the only way I can say you can get through a time like that. But also, you realize just how much you're loved by your family and the people who are so supportive around you. Reading friends who didn't even know me sent me all kinds of gifts and prayer shawls and quilts and flowers from Australia and beautiful cards, so much love and encouragement. So that was really touching to me. And I'm just grateful that the Lord gives us all kinds of grace in different ways to get through challenging times. So I'm very grateful. All my tests have come back clear. So
Praise
I'm really
God.
that's I passed 2 years already. Had a little upsetting, a couple of different skin cancer things, but they're not the kind that spreads or anything. But I've just had to deal with those. One this summer that's been kind of crazy, but we're getting through, and we're just asking the Lord for grace every day and trying to use it. Because now that I've gone through that, I even have a neighbor down the street who's going through a really serious cancer journey. And I've been able to really share, and she's ready to listen, and she accepts the Bible I gave her, and she just really wants to grow in her faith as she goes through this hard time. So it gives you great compassion for people who are going through it. And because you've gone through it, they'll listen to you, and they want to hear what you've learned. And even just this last week, I know Connie Cossette is going through breast cancer. And so we communicated, and I was able to message her, send her a devotional. That was really helpful to me. And so I just want to use what God's given me and the way he's helped me. I want to turn around and help some other people who are facing similar kind of situations.
Absolutely. And I think that when we allow God to use those points that have been some of the hardest in our lives, that's when real ministry opens up. Because like you said, we've walked the journey. And so for me, it's been miscarriages. In your case right now, it's the cancer. And I'm sure in other times it may have been your adoption journeys and things like that. And so, just being able to be like, hey, let me come alongside you because I've walked it, and I have empathy because that's been my experience, even though each person will have a different actual step-by-step journey. We can lock arms. And so that's wonderful that you've been able to do that. And so many people are saying that they love the idea for your time slip, and then that they're just really grateful that you are doing better, and love that God uses our pain to help others. So that is wonderful. Well, believe it or not, our half hour is gone. And
Fun. Thank you.
No Journey Too Far. It's been out for what, 3 or 4 weeks now? It's still pretty new.
Yeah, that just came out about a month ago.
So No Journey Too Far, and especially because of the jump in time, you can absolutely read this book first and then go back and fill in with Carrie's other books. But thank you so much for joining us tonight and for telling us more about your books and your writing. It's been so fun to catch up.
Great. Thank you so much, Cara. I love talking to you. Thanks everybody for tuning in with us.